Hello and welcome to Journeys and Journals. We're back in Roger Ramsey's history, and I mean way back. Roger, welcome to Journeys and Journals.
Thank you,
and
Bernie.
Where is the tree and what is the story?
Well, the tree is still there. That's a redwood tree in Stout Grove. And the people standing in front of the tree, that's the survey crew that surveyed the Redwood Highway from the state line, the California-Oregon line, to Crescent City back in 1921. The man standing all the way in the back of the photograph is my grandfather. All the way to the right is my grandmother Mabel. She was the cook for the crew. And then standing next to her is my father Marvin. He was an 8-year-old boy down there on that survey.
Oh my goodness.
And he thought he was going to get rich because all the men and on the crew, they had, they called them, well, they were just little 2-man tents. And they had a little stove in them called a snivelly stove. And just this little tiny wood heating stove. And so my grandpa took his son, my dad Marvin, up on the hillside, and they fell a Doug fir tree about this big around. And that little 8-year-old boy, he had his own saw, just like I had my own saw when I was a boy. And what it was, sometimes a crosscut would get broken, and it's a little short guy about this long. And he had one and I had one. The difference, the teeth on his are filed down about like this, and the teeth on mine are a lot longer. I didn't work as hard as he did. But he went up, he would saw off a block and roll it down next to each man's tent, this little 8-year-old boy, and they paid him 10 cents a block.
And he got rich.
And for an 8-year-old boy in 1921, that was some pretty good money.
Oh, this is, this story goes clear over into Coos County? No.
Well, no, it was Del Norte County.
Del Norte County?
Uh-huh.
Oh.
Yeah, and that tree is still there. That is the biggest tree in Stout Grove. It's still there.
Fantastic. Now, we're talking Dad, but in this picture, Roger, where we're talking World War II, who are we talking about? Same guy?
Yeah, that's my dad, and he worked for the Forest Service for about 10 years. He was did trail maintenance and worked all the lookouts, and that car right there, that trail car, was made in the Forest Service shop in Grants Pass for $5,000. This is back in the days before Jeeps or anything like that. Had a real narrow gauge. It was only about 3 or 3.5 feet wide.
Why was it so little?
Well, for traveling the trails, because they didn't have roads, and the trails were, really narrow. Well, they had the Gasky toll road that went up and over the mountain, but they used that one mostly on the Chetco Divide Trail and other trails. Well, my father was up there at the Ramsey cabin, living out his life's dream, placer mining, and he got his draft notice. And he went from that peaceful atmosphere up there, went through boot camp, through training, and was in the second wave at the landing of Leyte, Philippines, into heavy-duty combat. And when he landed there, about the second day he was there, he saw something across the runway at the airport. He was pulling guard duty at the airport, and it was kind of dark, and he thought, that's not what I think it is, and he walked a little closer, and it was. It was that trail car. They'd put a blade on it. They'd shipped it over there, since it was wartime and it was a federal thing, and they put a blade on it, and they were using it to fill in bomb craters on the runway at the Leyte airport.
Welcome home, Dad. Welcome home.
Yeah, well, he came back. He came back on the hospital. He got malaria and almost died, and this went through some really tough times. All his gear was lost or stolen. Came back on the hospital ship Lurleen to Hawaii, and then on back to the States.
The Lurleen was a luxury item, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. And he would never talk about the war, but when I was a boy, this was always around him. He always kept that. And all he would tell me is that he took it off a dead Japanese officer. Oh. And I knew there was more to the story than that. And he pointed out that there was the American officers had a canvas bag, and the Japanese officers had a nice leather bag like this, and on one side it had American-made pencils, and on the other side, top of the line, Parker fountain pens.
In the Japanese ones?
Yes, they didn't want their, they wanted the nicer American stuff.
Yeah, there's the pencil. I can see it here. Oh my goodness. This is actually talking history. Yeah, a lot of World War II guys came back, just went to work, raising their families, working hard, and they didn't.
He woke up, he would wake everybody up in the house for years, all of my young life with nightmares, just yelling and screaming in the, wake up that way, wake up everyone in the house.
And that means
he would never talk about this. And about 6 months before he passed away in 1990, I pinned him down. I knew there was more to the story. I said, Dad, I know there's more to the story about that Japanese officer's note bag. And a little tear started down his cheek, and he said, yes, son, there is. He said, I was just a young guy, and I'm out there and it's dark, and all of a sudden there's a face less than 10 feet away, and it's this Japanese officer. And we looked at each other right in the face, and he said, just like everything went into slow motion, because we knew one of us was going to die in less than a second, and I happened to be a little faster. And he just sobbed, and he said, I always wondered if that young guy, about his family and stuff, that I killed their son. But he said, then he would always follow that with, I did something important over there, and I did something right, and I'm glad that I did it, and would never try and undo it.
Wow. Now, is this that same guy?
No, that is Ray Briggs. That is part of the Briggs Strike Gold in 1904 up on Tanner Mountain. It's up off of Thompson Creek, miles from nowhere. And that young boy, his father, they were a poor family, like a lot of them were out in the Illinois Valley, and his father said, the family's getting hungry now. He sent him out, handed him a rifle, and he said, now you come back with a deer on your shoulders. I don't want to see you walk in this yard without a deer on your shoulders. Okay, Dad. And he took off, and he hunted, and he hunted, and he just kept walking further and further and further. He went miles. I mean, this is a long trek way up there on Tanner Mountain. And he finally saw a deer, and he shot it and wounded it. And he was following the deer, and he looked down, and when he was tracking the trail of blood, there was a rock, and he picked it up, and it was quartz rock, and it was about half gold. And then he looked, and he found another piece, and then another piece. And he forgot about the deer, and he just started stuffing these rocks in his pocket. And he came walking home into the yard, and his father just getting ready to lambaste him for not having a deer. And he said, no, I got something better, Dad. And he showed him that. And they went up the following day and located it. And this is the Briggs family. This is his father. And here's their location notice that they nailed up on that tree. And they're standing in the cut. They said if they could have gotten all the gold out in one piece, it was what geologists call a concentrated enrichment, that it would have been probably 20 feet long, a couple feet high, and maybe 8 or 10 inches wide, just laid into the quartz rock.
Excuse me, but in one day a poor family went to filthy rich?
1,777 ounces of gold came out of that little cut. The first shipment, they used nothing for mining equipment but a hand mortar to mortar up the rock and crush it and get the pieces of gold out. And the first shipment came into the Grants Pass Bank, Banking and Trust Company in 1904, 83 ounces of gold. And they would bring it out, the banker would bring it out several times during the day to show people. They'd say, hey, we want to see this gold. And they had it all spread out in this milk pan. And the word of that went all over, even to foreign countries, about this gold strike. And then Amos Voorhees, he wanted to check it out, the editor of the Courier.
Man.
And he took his right-hand man, Fred Minch, and he didn't drive a car, Mr. Voorhees didn't. He called it his wheel. That was his bicycle. And they rode their bicycles all the way out to the little town of Holland and started walking up to Tanner Mountain. And they met all these people coming back, all these miners. No, there's no strike up there. Well, they hadn't gone far enough. And he just stayed with it, and he went up there, and he said when he got there, he went in, Mr. Briggs invited him into the tent. He said there was gold in all the cooking utensils, anything there was sitting around was full of gold. And there was a man there representing a mining company that was ready to take for $100,000 cash a 5-day option. So they mined it for about 2.5 weeks, and then he took that 100,000 and gave the option on it, and then it was worked out. That guy, I don't even know if he got his 100,000 back, because it was just a concentrated enrichment.
What a story. What, you've brought so many things. What in the world is this about?
Oh, the bells. Those bells were off my great uncle's copper ore wagon. Now, earlier I had talked about Waldo. Well, then a town that came a little bit later was the little town of Tequilma out in the Illinois Valley. Well, at Tequilma, there was 4 operating copper mines.
Are we talking World War II?
The Queen of Bronze, prior to World War II. The Queen of Bronze, the Cowboy, the Lily, and I believe it was the Wildcat. I have it written down at home, but I know the 3, and I think the 4th one was the Wildcat. And the Queen of Bronze was the richest of the mines. And they would haul the copper ore. They didn't have a smelter. In later years, the last few years the mines operated, they finally built a smelter there in Tequilma. But they would have to haul the copper ore all the way to Tacoma, Washington. That was the closest smelter. So they would load it in wagons and take it to Waters Creek. And at that time, the O&C Railroad went out to Waters Creek, and they'd load it on a rail car at Waters Creek and then take it into Grants Pass, switch cars to the S&P, and because it was a different gauge railroad, that was a smaller, the tracks were a smaller gauge railroad going out
across the railroad bridge, across the Rogue River.
And,
I never heard these stories.
And so the bells, a lot of that wagon road, when they were hauling it to Waters Creek, was 1 lane.
Oh.
And you get 2 copper ore wagons head to head, they don't back up well.
No.
So the bells were, so when they hear bells, they would find a turnout and pull over so the other wagon could get
What pulled the
by.
wagons?
Horses.
How many horses?
I'm not sure. That was before my time, Bernie.
Oh, shucks. Oh, shucks.
There really are no photographs or anything of that. That's just been kind of lost in time. My father said when they lived there in Tequilma, he remembers over anything else his 8th birthday. They lived up on a hill. There's the Tequilma Clinic. The original Tequilma Clinic was in the old Johnson house there. And right across the street from that, my grandfather bought a property when he was a foreman there at the Queen of Bronze mine. And my father was born there in that house. And he said on his 8th birthday, Grandma came out on the porch with the old Victrola and cranked up the music, and Grandpa built a big bonfire out in the yard. And this was late. It was in November, and it was dark out. And the people in Tequilma, downtown Tequilma, because it sits up on a hill, and they heard this music and saw the bonfire. Well, what's going on up at the Ramseys? And here, the whole town showed up. And my grandpa had killed a deer, and they ate the whole thing. They roasted the deer on sticks over the fire.
Oh.
And they ate the whole deer up. And he said he remembers that over any other thing about Tequilma.
We were down near Klamath, California, and we saw sticks over a fire, and had to stop. And it was salmon, just sticks. So I can kind of think that. Would this be a kind of place that your family would have lived in?
Well, that's the...
Those are typical houses?
Nobody really knows. That was built by Chinese miners.
Oh.
And
so maybe it was their bunkhouse?
According to my father and grandfather, that, if they are right, that building was built in 1854 and is the oldest standing building in Josephine County. It's still out there.
Oh,
it's
my
still out
goodness.
there on the East Fork of Aldhouse Creek. And when the Chinese, they slowly all gravitated back home to China, but one of them stayed, and his name was China Bo. And he was still living there in that cabin in 1900. And my grandfather and other miners that were around in that area, they were, he was way up in his 90s. And he was just got so decrepit, he paid for all his provisions in gold.
In gold.
And he'd gotten so decrepit, he couldn't even make it down to the mine. And they were worried that he hadn't, winter was coming on and he hadn't gotten his provisions in. So they contacted Charlie Gilmore, the old packer, and Charlie got some guys together and they went in to a commissioner meeting. And they told the Josephine County commissioners about this, and they decided to pay for his provisions and pay Charlie Gilmore to pack them in. So they show up over there at that old cabin, and China Bo, he teeters out onto the porch of the cabin, and he spoke very little English, and he was just dumbfounded because here's all these men and here's all these provisions, and he just started right off saying, "No gold, no gold, no gold." He was just in a panic state. No gold, no gold, no pay, no pay. I can't pay, and so over and over, one at a time, they would take turns trying to explain to him, Josephine County paid for these provisions. And in the meantime, they're loading them into his pantry, putting them away for him. And so finally, he walks over to Charlie Gilmore, and Charlie said, he had a little tear running down his cheek, and he said, "Josephine County, very fine man."
I never heard that story.
That was 1900.
You've brought the gold panning and you've done your share of it, right? And that pan looks like it's been used a whole bunch. But what is this horn? Uh-oh!
There's a couple ounces of gold.
Couple ounces of gold? You're talking.
About $2,000 now.
No, you told me about losing an, oh my, now where did this come from?
That came from Coyote Creek, out the north end of the county. The assayers used to be able to tell all the gold when they used to turn in their gold, and if there was gold robberies and whatnot, they would take the gold to an assayer and he could tell, what creek it came off of, because it all has a different, something about the consistency of it.
Without having the mint mark on the coin, you can still tell where it came from.
They can tell where it came from.
Well, that's the way it was done. I know you kind of do, oops, wrong side, right? You have to have those little grooves. What do you call them?
They're just riffles. Yeah.
Kind of like on the Rogue River, and they're riffles anyhow, and that's
well, this is hard rock mining. This is one of the tunnels at the Greenback mine.
Because they did tunnel sometimes, and sometimes they blew it up.
Well,
sometimes
these two boys, my great-grandfather discovered the Columbia mine in about 1881. And these two boys, this is Ed Hannum and Lou Browning. They wandered into the mine one day, and they said to my great-grandpa, "Joe, we know you're getting rich here in this placer mine. Show us how to mine." "Oh, you kids, I'm trying to get some work done here. Tell you what I'll do." And he walked them up the trail. He said, "Now look for quartz on the ground. The quartz that you find is breaking off a quartz ledge that is feeding all this placer gold down here. And that's called float. So you pick up these pieces of float," and he loaned them a mortar and a pestle to crush it up. And then he said, "You take it down to the creek and you pan it out and you check your trace and you just keep going. And pretty soon you're going to find that gold ledge, and I'll see you kids later." And he went back to work. And then, "Oh, by the way, bring my mortar and pestle back when you're done." And so those two boys took off. Well, he never dreamed 4 hours later they found it. They found the gold ledge that became the Greenback mine. Their parents located it and became very, very wealthy.
Now, tell me, is this from Hannum and Kelt, that family?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. So, out of gratitude, this boy here, Ed Hannum, he hand carved this back in the 1880s and gave this to my great-grandfather as a gift. Since he did something really nice for him and telling him about that, how to find that mine. And it's called a bee hound. And the way this works, Bernie, you set this part down and you put a piece of comb honey inside of here. And then the bee will land all that comb honey, and then you take this part and you trap the bee in there. And then you pull this little slide back and you watch the bee in there feeding on the honey. And the reason for this contraption, if you let the bee go before he's full of honey, then he might stop at a flower or something and won't go all the way back to the bee tree. But once he hits that glass for long enough, you're sure he's full of honey. I know what he does from doing this with my grandfather when I was a boy. He taught me how to do this. And the bee will come out of there and they go in a circle like this, and they come off of that circle and they fly on a bee line to the bee tree. That's where the expression bee line came from. No matter where the tree is, 1 mile, 2 miles, they go on a straight line to it. So knowing this, well, the bee went this way. So I pick this up, I walk out there a couple hundred yards, catch another bee, and then eventually I find the bee tree. And Grandpa and I, we'd take the old crosscut saw and follow the tree, and hits the ground. You got some mad bees, and you wait until they settle down in there, and then we'd pile up leaves and twigs, especially a lot of dry leaves, and make a good smoke.
Fire.
Yeah, and smoke them out, and then reach in there and gather the honey. Well, over time, like with anything, by trial and error, we learned a better way. We would find several bee trees. And then I didn't bring them in, but I have a couple pairs of our old binoculars. And you just look, and I don't even need binoculars anymore. I've done it enough. You can just look up in the sunlight and you can see them moving. Just in the sunlight, it catches their wings when they're flying, and it's very, very noticeable. So you see them moving around. Well, they're still working. No. And so you don't do it every day, but you're just in that area and you pass by a bee tree and you watch them still working. And one day you'll come by and you look, no bees. Time to harvest. And if you take your binoculars and look up on the bark of the tree, the queen, because they'll fill that cavity, however big it is where they're working, and then they're done. They have to go find another tree, another home for their honey. So she'll leave 2 or 3 dozen guard bees, workers, to guard that honey, and then she takes a swarm and goes and finds a new tree. Well, then you follow the tree, and the guard bees go and tell the queen, and then you have that amount of time to get the honey out of there and get home with it before she comes back with the swarm.
Now, was that food for your family, or did you sell it?
Oh, we used it. We never ever sold honey. No. No.
Well,
on sourdough biscuits in the morning. That's what you did with honey.
I just...
Grandma's sourdough biscuits.
Grandma, dear old Grandma, we've got... Now, did she did a little everything.
A little bit of everything.
Even quilting and sewing and...
all of that stuff. And flowers. Oh, she loved flowers. She had beautiful flower gardens, arranged flowers. They would always have her helping for all the floats and the parades in her later life. And she even wrote a poem about flowers. She called it, "Give Me Flowers. I would rather have a little rose from the garden of a friend than to have the choicest flowers when my stay on earth must end. I would rather have a word of kindness just now said to me than flattery when my heart is still and this life has ceased to be. I would rather have a pleasant smile from friends I know are true than tears around my casket when I bid this world adieu. Give me all the flowers today, whether white or pink or red. I would rather have one blossom now than a truckload when I'm dead."
What? Please get that to us at Better Life Television. I will put it in the newsletter. That is a wonderful message, and it's the sentiment of my heart.
Mm-hmm.
Whose is this? I'm so afraid we're going to run out of time before you can tell me about this.
Well, this is really neat because when I was a boy and walking the trails of Siskiyou National Forest, at the forks of every trail there was a sign like this, and it would say, Ramsey Cabin 2 miles, and these porcelain signs are out there in the forest lands every place. And this is one of the very, very few that is left any place. And that, like everything else, has a story about it. My grandfather, Clay, had a pack train, and he was packing for miners way down in Northern California and all over. And he came to Grants Pass he came home to Kirby, and then he had to go to Grants Pass to transact some business. And when he came back home, he looked out back and his mules were gone. He came boiling into the house. He said, "Mabel, someone has stolen my mules." She said, "No, they didn't steal your mules, Clay. Just calm down." "Well, what happened?" "I sold them." "You did what?" "You sold my pack string?" "Clay, I miss you. You know, you're gone all the time off on these packing jobs. It's time for you to slow down and retire." And I talked to our friend Don Cameron, and he was the head of the Forest Service at the time, and he came up with a semi-retirement job for you. "Oh, yeah, I bet he did. What's that?" "Well, you know, there's forest fires, and every time there's a fire, and you know the mountains around here better than about anyone else around, and he made up this sign for you, and he told me to take it home and nail it on the side of the house. And then anytime there's a fire out here in the this valley, all the men gather here at our house, and then you take them out to fight the forest fire, and that's your new retirement job."
Oh my goodness! Now Teague, Harold Teague, had a similar thing, and when he was out on a fire, some new buck said, "You know, what do you have that old man around?" And they said, "Because he knows the forest."
Yep.
What is it? We've got a minute left.
There was, I don't know if I could tell that one in a minute, Bernie. That's going to take a little longer.
Journal.
Yeah, this was
bound in leather.
Yeah, I once owned the little town of Golden out in the Wolf Creek area, and God just blessed me with this because that tells about the only murder that ever took place in that town, and rhymes by a convict, and the guy wrote that in prison. For some reason, I bought that at a yard sale, and the murder was in 1887.
Oh my goodness.
Just what a coincidence. I mean, it was just unbelievable.
We've got 2 more pictures of Grandma, but we got this one in 1 minute. Tell me, what are the holes about?
That's out at the Kirbyville Museum, and my grandpa was on a double jack team and helped drill those holes in their double jacking at a demonstration back in about 1918.
Oh, the boys' toys.
Yeah, that's
Show
it.
off.
Showing them
Thanks
off.
for tuning into Journeys and Journals, and I thank you for coming with all your stories and all your things, and wow, it just helps me. I want everybody to say goodbye to your grandma, because I saw her when she grew up. You loved her a bunch.
Oh, a
right?
bunch, a bunch.
I'm Bernie Martin Beck, just sharing these wonderful stories of love. Bye-bye.